right, guys. Prince Sports at you again. Um, Now, I want to talk about the Detroit Pistons. All right. Now, back in the 80s, this team emerged with several perimeter players, bigs. They had just about all you need to win. They were a great, perfectly constructed team because um, they built their foundation on defense, all right? And they had a lot of scrappy players, a lot of guys that just wouldn't take crap from most people. They had a lot of enforcers, you know. They had a good bench. They had the Vinnie Johnson coming off the bench, the microwave. You had Bill Laimbeer, the enforcer. You had Isaiah Thomas, Allen Iverson before Allen Iverson. You know, he was efficient, had a jump shot, could score. And a lot of people would tell you if Isaiah Thomas was 6'6", he'd be even perceived as a even better basketball player. He might be in the top 5 for a lot of people if he was 6'6". You had Joe Dumars, a great defensive two guard, and he could also score, drop double digits a game. They had Dennis Rodman, one of the greatest rebounders and defensive players of all time. This team was stacked, all right? So this is no shot or no disrespect to those guys, but a lot of things get taken out of let's just say a lot of things get mistaken, or people tend to forget things, and they like to add extra stuff. So the word I'm looking for is probably people take things out of context, right? So now this team won 2 championships. They also hold the record for beating just about all the legends from the 80s and the early 90s. They kind of collapsed towards the 1991. It was pretty much the end of the bad boys. But they do hold the record for beating Magic Johnson and the Lakers more times than they beat the Detroit Pistons. Boston Celtics, they hold the record for beating that team the most times. And of course they hold the record for beating the Chicago Bulls. Okay, now put this in perspective, okay? Michael Jordan was the greatest basketball player in that era in the league from the late 80s, basically, because there was nobody really that could stop this guy. You needed like a whole team to collapse on him to stop him. And Detroit Pistons was the only team that beat Jordan by attacking him team defense and usually knocking him on his butt. You know, you heard Bill Laimbeer say on First Take, you know, we would throw multiple bodies at Jordan, and if he gets past us, we would knock him on his butt, you know? Because Jordan at the time was a scoring machine. He didn't know how to play a full team game. He didn't know how to get a lot of his teammates involved, you know? Sometimes when you're so good at one thing, you tend to stick at it. You know, you tend to stick to it, right? So that's what Jordan did most of the time, okay? So you had that going on, and they managed to win 2 championships. They also could have won 3 championships. They could have been the first at the time in the 90s and the 80s. All the great players was looking to three-peat. That was the biggest thing you could possibly do. So whoever had the ability to three-peat was going to be called the GOAT. And Jordan was the guy to break that mold. But keep in mind, the Pistons would have three-peated if it wasn't for a bogus call. Basically a shadow, a ghost call that cost them the finals, basically. That's how good the Detroit Pistons were in their time, all right? But they have to be exposed. We have to put everything when it rightfully belongs, because that team couldn't get past the Bulls for several times that they actually beat them. They had to result into NFL-like tactics just to beat Michael Jordan, okay? That's how much it took for them to beat the Bulls, okay? They really had no answer for the Bulls when Scottie Pippen came of age. And this is another thing you guys need to do. You need to give Scottie Pippen the rightful deserved credit that he deserves, because he was an X factor. Okay, the Bulls wouldn't get past the Pistons if it wasn't for Scottie Pippen. He was the X factor. Okay, they had no answer for him because Scottie Pippen would play defense, and he would score. You know, he was a multiple threat. Okay, he was somewhat LeBron James before LeBron James, but LeBron James is more talented all around than Scottie Pippen. But Scottie Pippen was always a great defender. You know, he had those long arms, so he was able to hold people down for the most part, right? But you had teams like the Detroit Pistons that were constantly act like they won multiple championships, like 5 or something like that. They would get overboard in their accomplishments. Yes, they were great. They were actually one of the first teams to have 2 Hall of Famers at the guard position, backcourt. You know, no other team really has that, and still didn't have that to this day. Steph and Clay would get that. Okay, they would be the second duo to have a backcourt Hall of Fame duo. But the thing about the Pistons, as good as they were slightly overrated because they had, the reason why they get less respect from certain people is because they try to turn basketball into the NFL. Now, whenever you're playing basketball and a guy constantly fouling you and he's constantly pitting his hands on you, that's indicating that he's not talented enough to beat you. Okay, so he has to result into hard fouls and hitting you a lot. I think the Detroit Pistons would have been a lot more respected if they won in a more fair way, you know. But Bill will tell you the only way they could win was by playing that rough defense. They exploited the NBA because the NBA had rules in place, but didn't have as much rules in place as they have now that protect stars and protect teams. So they were the first team to disrespect the rules. They always look for a loophole. Okay, that alone makes you a bad guy. You know, they were always the villains of the NBA because they looked at every little thing to get past on somebody. You know, in other words, it was like a cheating advantage. You know, whenever you're resulting to dirty tactics to beat somebody, that's basically cheating. So you get less respect for that. This is the reason why they're not as praised as they want to be. Okay, and they still, at the end of the day, only won 2 titles. Now, don't get me wrong. Winning an NBA championship is extremely hard. Okay, they get all the credit they deserve for winning a championship. I mean, in one season, they beat Jordan, Bird, and Magic. In one season, they beat all 3 of those guys. You know, that alone is something to hold high, in high regard. Okay, but they wouldn't have those 2 titles if they decided to play the game the right way. The Bulls definitely would have knocked them over. One of those 3 years out of they knocking them out of the playoffs. You know, you can make a case for a lot of seasons. I mean, the year when they went 7 games, Scottie Pippen caught migraines and he got hurt. You know, he got the reason why Scottie Pippen couldn't play the game so much because they were spacking and beating him around. You know, he had to grow much of a backbone. You know, and that's when Jordan comes into play because Jordan gave Scottie Pippen that backbone. Scottie Pippen would constantly get beat up on, and when you constantly getting beat up on, you're going to get headaches and stuff. I mean, Jordan took the same punishment, but Jordan was a different breed. He didn't mind it. I mean, he had bloody lips and all that stuff, but he still chose to ride out with the game, and he still chose to compete against those guys. You know. Scottie Pippen had to develop that toughness. But if you kept the game simple, even without that toughness, let's say Scottie Pippen didn't get hurt, there's a good chance the Bulls will probably beat the Detroit Pistons in that Game 7. I mean, the narrative around that is that they would have been beat the Detroit Pistons. So this is why the Detroit Pistons, even though they were a great basketball team, they were slightly I would say overhyped. I wouldn't say overrated because they have too much talent on that team to be overrated. They were overhyped to a certain example. And the people like to use that excuse to say, oh, they were this, they were that. They are one of the greatest teams of all time. But they probably wouldn't have been that if they played fair. You know? You got to give them all credit in the world. They did what they did to win, even though they used dirty tactics, but it's less respectful. So they're not going to get perceived as the team that people want them to be, you know, or a lot of diehard fans wanted them to be, you know. Now, you do hear a lot of Piston players not giving Jordan GOAT credit. It's okay, because whenever you play against somebody and you say, hey, you know what, we beat this guy a lot of times, we don't consider him as much of a dangerous threat as you do, you know. But keep in mind, you never beat Jordan the way, in terms of basketball, is played. You beat Jordan by using a lot of unnecessary roughness, okay? And with that roughness still in place, Jordan was still able to drop 49, 50, 60 points on you. So that shows how good Jordan was and how unguardable he was in his prime. You know, Jordan was the best player in the NBA since the late 80s, you know. And he could have been sitting on arguably 8 to 10 championships, because he would have won the championship in the 80s if it wasn't for that play and that physical style of Detroit Pistons. Detroit Pistons are also responsible for a lot of illegal defense that you see going on now. They changed the game in that way, you know, because the league said, hey, we're not going to let these guys exploit our defensive holes in our system. So because of the Detroit Pistons, basketball was changed in a lot of ways. It all started with them to a certain extent. The 80s was just a rough era. 90s was also a rough era. They will allow you to be a little more physical, because that's what the games call for. You know, you notice how a lot of games today go by 130 points per game. Back in the 80s and 90s, an average basketball game was 95 points, 98 points, because guys would really lock you down, you know? So scoring wasn't the number one focus like it is now. You know, now if you could score, you could literally outscore somebody to try to win a game. It wasn't like that back in the day, you know? So this is just a video dedicated to Detroit Pistons, saying how overhyped they were, because you could make a good argument that they wouldn't won those 2 championships if they didn't do what they did. They probably would have had one. You know, I'm not going to take nothing away from them, because they are a great basketball team, okay? I didn't even mention Mark Aguirre, John Sally, okay? They had so much good pieces on that team. They were a great basketball team. No matter how you slice it, they were a great basketball team. And you know how good they were to a certain extent? They had Dennis Rodman coming off the bench for a season. Think about it, you know? But with that said, Detroit Pistons were still overhyped in terms of trying to stop Jordan, okay? They never stopped Jordan. Jordan always was dropping buckets on those guys. They only beat down the rest of that team because they weren't mentally prepared to handle the Detroit Pistons' physicalness. But Jordan was always prepared for that. He was the only dog taking it. The rest of those guys had to develop a backbone to beat the Detroit Pistons. Peace.